Hello, travelers, and welcome back to the Dreamscape of history. Tonight, we are doing something different. In our previous journeys, we have descended deep into the earth, crawling through narrow tunnels and peering into the abyss beneath our feet. But tonight, we are looking up. We are turning our gaze away from the soil and toward the endless, brooding expanse of the sky. We often think of the atmosphere above us as a shield, a soft, blue blanket that wraps around our world, protecting us from the cold, indifferent vacuum of space. It is a comfort, a constant. We trust that the sun will rise, that the clouds will drift, and that the stars will stay fixed in their distant constellations. But sometimes that shield fails. Sometimes the barrier between our world and the cosmic ocean grows thin, and things slip through. If you are joining us for the first time, find a comfortable spot, dim the lights, and let the tension of the day unclench from your shoulders. I want you to take a moment to look at your surroundings. Is it dark where you are? Can you see the moon through your window? Or is the sky hidden behind a veil of clouds? The story we are about to explore reminds us that even the sky, that vast, beautiful dome we sleep under every night, has secrets of its own. It is a story of a morning when the heavens did not just brighten, they broke. So, take a deep breath, let the silence of the room settle around you, and let us travel back in time, to the remote, frozen wilderness of Siberia, to the summer of 1908.
The date is June 30th. The location is the Podkamennaya Tunguska River Basin, a region so isolated, so rugged, that it barely appeared on the maps of the time. This is the taiga, the largest forest in the world, a sea of pine, spruce, and larch trees that stretches for thousands of miles. In 1908, it was a place of profound silence, inhabited only by the indigenous Evenki people, who followed the reindeer herds, and a handful of Russian fur traders living in lonely outposts. It was a crisp, clear morning. The sun had risen early, as it does in the high latitudes during the summer, bathing the forest in a sharp golden light. At a small trading post called Vanawara, located about 40 miles away from the heart of the wilderness, a man named S.B. Semenov was sitting on the porch of his house. He was looking north, watching the mist rise off the river, preparing for another slow, predictable day. But at 7:17 a.m., the world changed. Later, Semenov would tell researchers that he saw the sky split in two. High above the forest, a massive cleft appeared in the blue, filled with a blinding bluish-white fire. It was not a flash, it was a presence, a column of light so intense that it outshone the sun, casting harsh, terrified shadows against the walls of the trading post. In that split second, Semenov felt a wave of heat wash over him, sudden and suffocating. He described it as if his shirt had caught fire, the fabric searing against his skin. He instinctively covered his face, but before he could even process the heat, the ground vanished beneath him. A shock wave, invisible and solid as a hammer, slammed into the trading post. Semenov was thrown from his porch, tumbling across the dirt. The windows of the house shattered inwards, the glass turning to dust. The door was ripped from its hinges. And then came the sound. It was not a single explosion. It was described as a roar, a deep, guttural thundering that sounded like heavy stones falling from the sky, or the firing of heavy artillery cannons, rolling on and on without end. The earth shook with such violence that horses were knocked off their feet hundreds of miles away. The river water churned and foamed as if boiling. But as quickly as the fire had appeared, it vanished. The roar faded into a low rumble, leaving the witnesses at Vanawara bruised, deafened, and staring into a forest that had suddenly fallen silent. They had no way of knowing that they had just survived the largest impact event in recorded human history.
The violence of the explosion was local, but the aftermath was global. The energy released that morning was later estimated to be roughly equivalent to 15 megatons of TNT. That is 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The shockwave did not just knock down S.B. Semenov, it traveled around the world. Sensitive barometers in London, in Berlin, even as far away as Washington, D.C., detected the pulse of the air. The waves circled the Earth twice, ringing the atmosphere like a giant bell. But the most haunting effect occurred in the days that followed. In the hours after the explosion, millions of tons of dust, ice crystals, and meteoric debris were injected into the upper atmosphere. These particles caught the high-altitude sunlight, creating a phenomenon that became known as the white nights. For 3 days, the night sky over Europe and Asia did not go dark. In London, confused citizens walked out into their gardens at midnight to find the sky glowing with a strange, silvery phosphorescence. It was bright enough to read a newspaper by, bright enough to play cricket on the village greens without lanterns. In Stockholm, photographers were able to take pictures of the city streets at 2 a.m. without using a flash. It was beautiful, but it was also deeply unsettling. The sky looked sick, bruised with electric blue and noctilucent clouds that shimmered like ghosts. The world knew something had happened. Something massive had disturbed the balance of the air. But because the Tunguska region was so inaccessible, and because Russia was on the brink of war and revolution, no one went to look. For 19 years, the forest kept its secret. The silence returned to the taiga, but the stories began to spread among the Evenki, whispers of a dead place where the god of thunder, Ogdi, had descended to curse the earth. It wasn't until 1927, nearly 2 decades later, that a Russian mineralogist named Leonid Kulik finally managed to lead an expedition into the impact zone. Kulik was convinced that a massive meteorite made of iron had struck the Earth. He dreamed of finding a crater, a glorious pit filled with extraterrestrial metal that would make him famous and provide the Soviet Union with a valuable resource. The journey was a nightmare. They hacked their way through mosquitoes, swamps, and dense undergrowth. As they got closer to the epicenter, the local guides began to panic. They refused to go further, speaking of the valleys of horror where the fire had burned the birds in the sky and the reindeer in the fields. Kulik pressed on, eventually cresting a ridge that overlooked the valley of the stony Tunguska. And there he saw it. It was a scene of devastation that defied all logic. Kulik expected a crater. He expected a hole in the ground. Instead, he found a graveyard of trees. For 830 square miles, an area larger than the city of London, the forest had been flattened. 80 million trees, distinct ancient pines, were lying on their sides. From the top of the ridge, it looked like a pattern. The trees were not just knocked down randomly, they were all pointing away from a single central point. It looked as if a giant hand had come down from the heavens and simply brushed them aside. Kulik and his team descended into the zone, walking over the trunks of the fallen giants. As they reached the absolute center, the epicenter of the blast, the scene changed again. Here, the trees were still standing, but they were dead. Their branches had been sheared off, their bark stripped away by the intense heat, leaving them looking like a forest of black telegraph poles, standing upright, guarding nothing. There was no crater. There was no meteorite. there was no fragment of a star, just a scorched, flat silence. Kulik spent years searching for the rock that hit the earth. He drained peat bogs, he drilled into the soil, but he never found it. And that is because, as we now understand, the object never touched the ground. The Tunguska Event is now classified as an airburst. Scientists believe that a stony asteroid, or perhaps a fragment of a comet, roughly 150 feet across, entered Earth's atmosphere traveling at 33,000 miles per hour. The immense pressure of the air in front of the rock acted like a wall. The asteroid was crushed, heated to tens of thousands of degrees until it couldn't take the stress anymore. At an altitude of about 5 miles, it detonated. The rock vaporized instantly, turning into a cloud of gas and dust. The energy of the moving rock was converted into pure heat and shock. The explosion pushed the air down like a piston, slamming into the forest with enough force to flatten mountains of wood, and heat intense enough to ignite the shirt on S.B. Semenov's back 40 miles away. The telegraph poles at the center remained standing because the blast wave came directly from above, pushing them straight down into the soil rather than knocking them over sideways. It is a phenomenon we later saw in Hiroshima, where buildings directly beneath the bomb remained standing while those around them crumbled. The Evenki were right, in a way. It was the fire of the gods. It was a moment when the universe reached down and touched the earth, not with a fist, but with a breath. A hot, violent exhale that erased a forest in a heartbeat. As you lie there tonight, safe under your roof, try to imagine that morning, the silence of the forest, the sudden light, and then the wind. It is a reminder that we live on a small, fragile blue marble, floating in a very crowded shooting gallery. The solar system is full of rocks, drifting in the dark. Most of them miss us. Some of them burn up as shooting stars. But on June 30th, 1908, one of them got through, and it reminds us that while we look down at our phones and our books and our busy lives, the sky is always watching, and sometimes the sky comes down to meet us.
Let us leave the frozen, shattered forests of Siberia behind. Let the image of the burning tiger fade from your mind, and let us travel back further in time and halfway across the world to a place that feels much more familiar, much more grounded. We find ourselves in the rolling green hills of Bath County, Kentucky. The year is 1876. It is a different world here, a quiet, agrarian world of wooden fences, unpaved roads, and the slow, rhythmic pace of farm life. The date is March 3rd. It is a Friday. The time is just after the noon hour, a time when the sun is high and bright. The winter frost has begun to melt, leaving the ground soft and smelling of damp earth and new growth. The sky above is a piercing, cloudless blue, a perfect canvas of calm. There are no storms on the horizon. There is no wind to speak of. It is the kind of day that farmers pray for, a day of absolute, predictable clarity. In the yard of a small farmhouse near the settlement of Olympia Springs, a woman named Mrs. Crouch is going about her daily chores. She is outside, perhaps tending to the soap-making kettle, or perhaps feeding the chickens that scratch and peck in the dust. She is surrounded by the comforting sounds of the countryside, the rustle of dry leaves, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the porch swing. It is a scene of utter normalcy, a painting of American rural life. But the thing about normalcy is that it is fragile. It is a thin veil draped over the chaos of the universe.
And on this particular Friday afternoon, just a few steps away from her front porch, Mrs. Crouch was about to witness that veil being torn away, not by fire or by wind, but by something far more grotesque. It began with a sound. Unlike the roar of Tunguska, this was not a sound that shook the earth. It was small. It was wet. It was a distinct, rhythmic slapping noise against the ground. Thwack, splat, thud. Mrs. Crouch paused, looking up. She expected to see rain, perhaps a sudden spring shower passing overhead, but the sky was still that same unbroken blue. There were no dark clouds, there was no thunder, and yet the sound continued. It grew louder, heavier. It sounded like someone was throwing wet rags against the side of the barn. She looked down at the ground near her feet, and her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. It wasn't water hitting the dust. It wasn't hail. Lying in the dirt, glistening in the afternoon sun, was a piece of raw, red meat. It was roughly the size of a human hand, ragged at the edges, bleeding slightly into the soil. Before she could gasp, another piece fell, landing on the wooden fence rail with a wet slap. Then another and another. Mrs. Crouch stood frozen in the center of a nightmare. The sky, the source of light and rain and air, was raining flesh. It fell all around her, covering an area of roughly 100 yards long by 50 yards wide. It stuck to the fence posts like strange, organic moss. It hung from the leafless branches of the oak trees, dripping red droplets onto the dry leaves below. It thudded onto the roof of the house, a macabre drumbeat that no one else in the world could hear. For several minutes, the shower continued. The air, which had smelled of spring soil just moments before, now carried the heavy, metallic scent of iron and blood. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. The last piece fell, settling into the grass, and Mrs. Crouch was left standing in the silence under a beautiful blue sky, surrounded by the scattered remains of something that had no business being in the clouds.
Panic is a natural reaction to the impossible, but in 1876, curiosity often outweighed fear. Mrs. Crouch called for her husband, and soon the neighbors arrived. They stood in the yard, men in suspenders and hats, staring at the ground in disbelief. This was not star jelly, that strange translucent slime often found in fields after meteor showers. This was distinct, fibrous, muscle tissue. It looked like beef. It looked fresh. In fact, some of the pieces were described as looking as though they had been butchered just moments before. The fat still white and firm, the muscle distinct and red. And here we encounter one of the most baffling aspects of historical mysteries, the willingness of people to interact with the unknown. In the modern world, we would call a hazmat team. We would quarantine the area. But in 1876, two local men, whose names have been lost to history, but whose bravery, or perhaps foolishness, is immortal, decided to conduct the ultimate test. They picked up pieces of the sky meat, they inspected it, and then they ate it. They reported that it did not taste toxic, it did not taste rotten. They claimed it tasted like mutton, or perhaps venison. It was gamey, unfamiliar, but undeniably animal. News of the Kentucky meat shower spread through the newspapers like wildfire. It was a sensation. The New York Times wrote about it. Scientists from all over the country requested samples. The meat was packed in jars of glycerin and alcohol and shipped to laboratories in Newark and Louisville. The world wanted an answer. Religious groups claimed it was manna from heaven, a sign of God's bounty, though raw meat falling into the dirt seemed like a strange delivery system for divine grace.
Others whispered of a whirlwind, a tornado that had perhaps struck a slaughterhouse in a neighboring county, lifting the butchered carcasses into the stratosphere and dropping them miles away. But the weather records showed no tornadoes that day. The sky had been clear. So, what was it?
The samples reached the microscope of Dr. L.D. Kastenbein, a distinguished professor of chemistry. He examined the tissue closely. He confirmed that it was not merely a fungus or a slime mold mimicking flesh. It was lung tissue. It was cartilage. It was muscular fiber. It belonged to a large animal, likely a horse, or a human infant, or a bear. But Dr. Kastenbein proposed a theory that, while scientifically sound, is perhaps more horrifying than any supernatural explanation. He looked at the way the meat was shredded. He looked at the variety of tissues, lungs, muscle, cartilage mixed together. And he looked at the clear sky. He realized that the only things occupying the sky that day were birds, specifically vultures. Kentucky is home to the black vulture and turkey vulture. These birds are scavengers, nature's cleanup crew. They gorge themselves on the carcasses of dead cattle or horses until they are so full they can barely fly. When a flock of vultures is startled, perhaps by a predator or a sudden wind, they have a defense mechanism. To lighten their load for a quick escape, they vomit. Dr. Kastenbein painted a picture that turned the miracle into a grotesquerie. He suggested that a massive flock of buzzards, flying high above the limit of human vision, had been drifting over the Crouch Farm. Something had spooked them, and in unison, dozens, perhaps hundreds of these birds had purged the contents of their stomachs. The meat had fallen thousands of feet, cooling in the upper air, losing its acidic coating and landing as a shower of fresh chunks on the farm below. The men who had tasted it, who had rolled the mystery around on their tongues expecting a cosmic revelation, had, in fact, eaten the regurgitated lunch of a buzzard.
The vulture theory is widely accepted today as the truth. It explains the tissue types. It explains the clear sky. It explains the localized area of the fall. But even with the explanation, the image remains haunting. We like to think of the sky as pure. It is the realm of clouds, of sunlight, of stars. It is above us in every sense of the word. The Kentucky meat shower violated that purity. It turned the sky into something visceral, something biological, something dirty. Imagine being Mrs. Crouch. Imagine waking up the next day. The rain has washed the blood from the fence. The dogs have eaten the scraps from the yard. The world looks normal again. But you know that at any moment, without a single cloud to warn you, the sky can open up and drop the raw, red reality of nature right onto your doorstep. It is a reminder that we are not separate from the food chain. We are not separate from the biology of the planet. We are living at the bottom of an ocean of air. And sometimes the things swimming above us drop their scraps. So, as you drift towards sleep tonight, visualize a clear blue sky, a perfect, endless blue. But do not look too closely. Do not wonder what those specks are, circling high in the glare of the sun. Just close your eyes and be thankful for the roof over your head.
Let us move forward in time to the autumn of 1979. The world is a very different place. The pastoral quiet of the Kentucky hills has been replaced by the hum of mainframes, the scratching of radar needles, and the silent, terrifying stalemate of the Cold War. It is a time when the sky is no longer just a canvas for clouds and birds. It has become a frontier. It is filled with metal eyes, satellites that circle the globe in silent orbits, watching, waiting, listening. They are the sentinels of the nuclear age, placed there to ensure that no one breaks the rules. Among these sentinels was a pair of American satellites known as Vela. The name comes from the Spanish word for watchman or vigil. These were not spy satellites looking for tanks or troop movements. They had a singular, terrifying purpose: to detect the blinding signature of a nuclear explosion. They were old machines by 1979, drifting in high orbit 69,000 miles above the Earth. They looked down on the places where humans rarely went, the vast empty stretches of the oceans, the frozen poles, the deserts. On the night of September 22nd, Vela 6911 was drifting over the southern hemisphere. It was looking down at a patch of darkness located between the southern tip of Africa and the ice shelf of Antarctica. This is the Prince Edward Islands region, a place of rough seas, freezing winds, and absolute isolation. There are no shipping lanes here. There are no cities. There is only the churn of the black water and the curve of the earth. It was 1 a.m. local time. The world below was asleep. The ocean was dark. But deep in the electronic brain of Vela 6911, a sensor tripped. It happened in milliseconds. The satellite's bang meters, specialized sensors designed to detect intense pulses of light, recorded a sudden, violent brightness rising from the surface of the ocean. But it wasn't just a flash. Lightning flashes, meteors flash. The Vela satellites were programmed to ignore those. They were looking for a specific, horrifying fingerprint known as the double flash. When a nuclear bomb detonates, the initial explosion creates a fireball so hot that it briefly becomes opaque to its own light, dimming for a fraction of a second before the shock wave expands and the light bursts through again. It is a blink, a double pulse. It is the unique, unmistakable signature of the splitting atom. Nature does not blink, only a nuclear bomb blinks. Vela 6911 saw the double flash. The data was beamed instantly to the United States. In windowless rooms at Patrick Air Force Base and deep within the Pentagon, alarms began to ring. The computers analyzed the curve of the light. It matched the profile of a 2 to 3 kiloton explosion, roughly a fifth of the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The implications were catastrophic. This was 1979. The Partial Test Treaty had been signed years ago. Nuclear testing in the atmosphere was illegal. It was forbidden. If someone had detonated a bomb in the open air, they had broken the most important law in international relations. President Jimmy Carter was woken up. The National Security Council was convened. The question on everyone's lips was not what happened. The satellite was never wrong, but who? Who would dare to test a weapon in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere? Was it the Soviet Union? A rogue test by China? Or was it a new player, a nation that had secretly acquired the bomb and was testing it in the dark, hoping the world was looking the other way? The United States Air Force scrambled. They sent WC-135 aircraft, specialized sniffers, racing toward the South Atlantic. These planes were designed to detect radioactive iodine and xenon gases in the wind, the fallout that inevitably drifts on the breeze after a nuclear event. They combed the skies for days. They flew grid patterns over the churning gray waves, but the ocean kept its secret. The sniffers found nothing. The background radiation levels were normal. There was no mushroom cloud, no debris field, no radioactive plume. It was as if the explosion had been a phantom. But the intelligence agencies began to look closer.
They looked at the movement of ships in the days leading up to the flash, and they noticed something strange. A task force of the South African Navy had been conducting exercises in that exact region, and there were whispers, intelligence reports suggesting that Israel, a nation that officially denied having nuclear weapons, had been sharing technology with South Africa. The theory began to take shape. It was a joint operation, a clean test, perhaps conducted on a barge or a low-yield weapon designed to minimize fallout, detonated on a cloudy night to hide the flash from human eyes, but not from the unblinking eye of the Vela satellite. It was the perfect crime, a secret test by two pariah nations hidden in the most desolate corner of the map. But without the smoking gun of radiation, it couldn't be proven. And accusing allies or potential strategic partners of breaking the nuclear ban was a diplomatic nightmare that Washington was not eager to embrace. As the politicians scrambled for a cover story, a strange piece of evidence emerged from the most unlikely of places. It did not come from a spy plane or a radar station. It came from a sheep. In the weeks following the flash, scientists in Australia, thousands of miles away from the Prince Edward Islands, noticed something odd. They were analyzing the thyroid glands of sheep slaughtered in Victoria and Tasmania. Thyroid glands are like biological sponges for iodine, specifically iodine-131, a radioactive isotope created by nuclear fission. The samples showed a sudden, unexplained spike in iodine-131. It wasn't dangerous, but it was there, and it hadn't been there the month before. Simultaneously, the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico detected a strange ripple in the ionosphere, a disturbance in the upper atmosphere traveling from the southeast to the northwest, exactly the ripple you would expect from a shockwave originating in the South Atlantic. The pieces of the puzzle were fitting together. The satellite saw the flash, the sheep ate the fallout, the ionosphere felt the punch. It seemed undeniable. A bomb had gone off. But then, the narrative changed. The White House convened a panel of scientists known as the Ruina Panel. Their job was to review the evidence, but their conclusion was baffling. They declared that the Vela signal was likely a false alarm. They proposed that a micrometeoroid, a tiny grain of space dust, had struck the satellite. They suggested that a piece of the satellite itself had flaked off, reflecting sunlight into the sensor at the exact millisecond required to mimic a double flash. They dismissed the thyroids as a statistical error. They dismissed the ionosphere data as a coincidence. They told the world that the sky had simply played a trick on the machine. To this day, the Vela incident remains officially classified as a mystery. The United States government has never formally admitted that it was a nuclear test. But those who worked on the Vela program, the engineers who built the eyes in the sky, never believed the meteor theory. They pointed out that the satellites had functioned perfectly for a decade. They had detected 41 previous nuclear tests, and they had never, not once, made a mistake. Why would the machine lie this one time? The generally accepted truth among historians is that it was a test, likely a joint Israeli-South African venture. The meteor story was a convenient lie, a way to avoid sanctioning allies during a critical point in the Cold War. It was a moment where the truth was too inconvenient to be acknowledged. But as you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the isolation of that event. Imagine the flash, a second sun blooming in the darkness above the freezing waves. For a fraction of a second, the ocean was lit up as bright as noon. The fish swimming near the surface would have seen it. The seabirds would have been blinded. And then darkness returned. The mushroom cloud rose into the night, unseen by any human eye, dissipating into the wind. The radiation drifted across the water, settling into the wool of sheep halfway across the world. It is a reminder of how much happens in the dark. We live in a world of constant surveillance, of cameras and sensors, and yet, even now, it is possible to light a fire in the void and have no one admit they saw the smoke. The Vela satellite is gone now, deactivated and drifting as space junk, but the mystery remains, orbiting the Earth like a ghost, a flash of light that officially never happened.
Let us travel back to October 13th, 1917. The world is at war. The Great War, World War I, is grinding an entire generation of young men into the mud of France and Belgium. It is a time of despair, of hunger, and of a deep, pervasive cynicism. In Portugal, the government is strictly secular, anti-clerical, determined to crush the superstitions of the past. But in a natural amphitheatre known as the Cova da Iria, near the small village of Fatima, the world is not looking at the trenches, it is looking at a small home oak tree. For months, 3 young shepherd children, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, have claimed that a lady made of light has been visiting them on the 13th of every month. She has promised them a miracle. She has promised that on this day, in October, she will perform a sign so great that everyone will be forced to believe. News of the prophecy spread like wildfire. By the morning of the 13th, a crowd of staggering size had gathered. Estimates range from 30,000 to 100,000 people. They were not just believers, they were journalists from the major newspapers, cynical intellectuals, government officials eager to debunk the fraud, and thousands of peasants desperate for hope. But the weather did not look miraculous, it looked miserable. A torrential storm had battered the region all night. The roads were turned into rivers of sludge. The fields of the Cova were a quagmire of ankle-deep mud. The crowd stood huddled under black umbrellas, shivering, soaked to the bone, their clothes heavy with water. The appointed hour of noon came and went. The rain continued to fall in sheets. The skeptics began to smirk. The believers began to weep. It seemed that the miracle was a lie, a childish fantasy washed away by the cold Atlantic rain. And then, at roughly 1 p.m., Lucia pointed to the sky and screamed, "Look at the sun!" The rain stopped, not gradually, but instantly. The heavy, dark storm clouds that had choked the sky for hours split apart, tearing open like a curtain, and there, in a patch of clear blue, stood the sun. But it was not the sun they knew. It was not the blinding, painful orb of fire that forbids you to look at it. Witnesses described it as a disk of opaque silver. It looked like a plate made of dull mother-of-pearl. It was sharp, distinct, and strangely, you could stare directly at it without hurting your eyes. A silence fell over the 70,000 people. The wind died, and then the sun began to move. It started to spin. It rotated on its axis like a wheel of fire, gathering speed. As it spun, it began to throw off beams of light, but not white light. It cast massive, sweeping bands of color across the landscape. Witnesses described the world turning strange and alien. The wet rocks, the trees, the faces of the crowd were suddenly bathed in deep violet, then blood red, then emerald green, then a sickly yellow. The light washed over the hills, dyeing the white shirts of the peasants in fantastic shifting hues. It happened 3 times. The sun spun, stopped, and spun again, faster and faster, until it looked like a dizzying, churning wheel of color.
The spinning was beautiful.
But what happened next was terrifying. Suddenly, the silver disk seemed to detach itself from the firmament. It broke loose from the sky, and then it began to fall. It didn't just drift, it zigzagged wildly, plummeting toward the earth like a falling stone. It grew larger and larger, filling the vision of the crowd. The heat increased instantly. A wave of warmth washed over the freezing multitude. Panic erupted. 70,000 people fell to their knees in the mud. They believed the world was ending. They believed the sun was crashing into the earth to burn them alive. Men were shouting their sins to the sky, begging for forgiveness. Women covered their children with their bodies. Avelino de Almeida, the chief editor of the pro-government, anti-religious newspaper O Século, was there. He had come to mock the event. Instead, he wrote this: "Before the astonished eyes of the crowd, the sun trembled, made sudden incredible movements outside all cosmic laws. The sun danced according to the typical expression of the peasants. For 10 minutes the sun danced. It threatened to crush them. And then, just as it seemed about to touch the treetops, it reversed course. It climbed back into the sky, zigzagging back to its original position, and returned to being the normal, blindingly bright sun of a Portuguese afternoon."
The terror faded. The crowd stood up, shaking, weeping, checking their bodies to see if they were burned. But then they noticed something else. Something that, to a physicist, is perhaps more impossible than the dancing sun. Moments before, they had been soaked. Their hair was matted with rain, their wool coats were heavy and dripping water. The mud was deep and sloppy. But now they were dry. Witnesses reported that their clothes felt untouched by water. The ground, which had been a swamp, was firm and dry. The heat of the falling sun had apparently evaporated millions of gallons of water in a matter of minutes, without burning the skin of the people standing there. This detail is often overlooked in the retelling, but it is the physical anchor of the mystery. Mass hysteria can explain seeing lights, it can explain fear, but hallucination does not dry wet wool. Hallucination does not harden mud. What happened that day? The Church, of course, calls it a miracle, but scientists and meteorologists have struggled with the miracle of the sun for a century. Some propose the sundog theory, suggest that ice crystals in the high atmosphere created a mock sun, a parhelion, that appeared to move. But sundogs are static. They do not spin. They do not turn the world purple. And they certainly do not dry clothes. Others suggest retinal distortion. They argue that staring at the sun for too long caused the crowd's retinas to burn, creating afterimages, spinning artifacts, and changes in color perception. This explains the visual effects, but it doesn't explain why everyone saw it at the same time, or why people miles away who were not staring at the sun also reported seeing the colors in the sky. And then there is the UFO theory, the silver disk, the spinning, the falling motion, the lack of noise. It fits the profile of modern UFO sightings perfectly. Was it a craft? A display of technology so advanced it looked like magic to the peasants of 1917? Or was it a case of mass psychogenic illness? Did 70,000 people, desperate for hope in a time of war, project their desire onto the sky so hard that they broke reality? The terrifying thing about the miracle of the sun is not just the event itself, it is the scale. If it was a hallucination, it means that human consciousness is capable of syncing up, of creating a shared nightmare so vivid that it overwrites the senses. And if it wasn't a hallucination, if the sun really did move, then the universe is far stranger and far more unstable than we dare to admit.
So, as you close your eyes tonight, think of the sun. We trust it to rise. We trust it to stay in its place. But once, in 1917, it decided to dance, and we still don't know why.
Let us travel back to the birth of a nation. The year is 1780. The American Revolutionary War is raging. General George Washington is encamped with his troops in Morristown, New Jersey, fighting not just the British, but the cold, the hunger, and the exhaustion of a stalemate. But on the morning of May 19th, the soldiers looked up from their trenches, and the farmers in New England looked up from their ploughs and realized that the war was suddenly the least of their worries. It began in the morning, distinct and unsettling. The sun rose, but it looked wrong. It was not the bright yellow orb of spring. It was a deep, angry red. It hung in the sky like a bloodshot eye, peering through a strange, heavy haze that had settled over the colonies of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. By 10 a.m., the color of the world began to shift. The sky did not turn gray, as it does before a rainstorm. It turned a sickly, brassy yellow. Witnesses described the light as copper-colored. It filtered down through the trees, casting strange alien shadows on the ground. The green grass appeared to turn blue. The white paint of the meeting houses took on a jaundiced yellowish hue. The air grew heavy. It smelled of something ancient, something burning, distinct from the smell of gunpowder that had haunted the colonies for years. It was a smell like soot or sulfur, a scent that triggered a primal alarm in the brains of every living thing in the region. The birds, the robins and the blue jays, stopped singing. They retreated into the thickets, tucking their heads under their wings. The roosters, confused by the changing light, began to crow, believing that evening had come early. And then the copper light began to fade. By 11 a.m., the darkness began to descend in earnest. It moved from the southwest to the northeast, rolling over the land like a heavy velvet curtain. This was not the dimness of a storm. This was the crushing blackness of midnight. By noon, the time when the sun should have been at its zenith, the time of maximum light, New England was plunged into total obscurity. Imagine the psychological terror of that moment. In 1780, there were no electric lights. There was no internet to check the weather radar. There was only the sun, the clock by which humanity set its entire existence. And at 12 p.m., the clock stopped. In the farmhouses, women abandoned their looms. They rushed to the hearths, fumbling for flint and steel, lighting tallow candles just to see the faces of their children. The noon meal was eaten by candlelight. Outside, the natural world collapsed into chaos. Cows, creatures of absolute habit, stopped grazing in the fields. They turned around and walked back to the barns, lowing to be milked, confused by a night that had arrived 6 hours too early. Frogs began to peep in the marshes. Bats flew out of their caves, flitting through the unnatural gloom. Flowers, the tulips and the morning glories, folded their petals shut. The darkness was so thick that a sheet of white paper held inches from the eyes was invisible. It was a physical, suffocating weight, a darkness that you could feel pressing against your skin.
Panic began to spread through the population. Remember, this was a deeply religious society. The Puritans of New England knew their Bible. They knew the prophecies of the Book of Revelation. The sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. People believed that this was it, the end of days, the final judgment. The war, the famine, and now the death of the sun. It was all leading to this moment. Men dropped to their knees in the town squares, praying for salvation. Neighbors confessed sins to one another, hoping to clear their conscience before the trumpet sounded. But in Hartford, Connecticut, inside the State House, a different kind of drama was unfolding. The Connecticut Governor's Council was in session. As the windows of the chamber grew black, the members of the council became agitated. Some of them stood up, trembling, and moved for an immediate adjournment. They argued that if the day of judgment was at hand, they should not be found debating taxes and troop movements. They should be with their families, preparing their souls. But one man, a counselor named Abraham Davenport, remained seated. Davenport was a man of stern, practical Yankee stock. He looked at his terrified colleagues, then looked at the black windows, and he delivered a line that is echoed through history. He stood up and said, "I am against adjournment. The day of judgment is either approaching or it is not. If it is not, there is no cause for an adjournment. If it is, I choose to be found doing my duty. I wish, therefore, that candles may be brought." It is a profound image to hold in your mind as you drift off. The world ending outside, the sun extinguished, the birds silent, and inside a wooden room, a single man demanding a candle so he could finish his work, a beacon of stubborn order in a world of chaos.
The candles were brought. The council continued, but the darkness outside did not lift. The dark day lasted for 14 hours. It covered most of New England, reaching as far north as Portland, Maine, and as far south as New Jersey. General Washington noted it in his diary, writing simply of the heavy and uncommon kind of clouds. But the terror reached its peak when night actually fell. The moon was scheduled to be full that night. People waited, hoping that the moon would break the spell. But when the moon finally rose, it did not look like the moon. Those who could see it through the breaks in the heavy atmosphere described it as a ball of blood. It was a deep, horrific crimson. It cast no light. The darkness on the ground remained absolute. It was described by witnesses as Egyptian darkness, a reference to the biblical plague, a darkness that could be felt. Travelers were stranded on the roads. Horsemen had to dismount and feel the ground with their hands to stay on the path. The world had been erased.
So, what killed the sun on May 19th, 1780? It took centuries for science to fully explain the dark day. We now know through the study of tree rings, dendrochronology, that 1780 was a year of massive, catastrophic forest fires in Canada, specifically in the Algonquin Highlands of Ontario. A combination of a drought, high winds, and a massive firestorm sent millions of tons of thick, oily smoke into the upper atmosphere. The smoke drifted south, caught in a stagnant weather system that trapped it over New England. The copper light was the sun filtering through layers of smoke. The blood moon was the result of the red spectrum of light being the only thing capable of penetrating the haze. The smell of soot, the sulfur that people feared was the scent of hell, was actually the scent of burning pine forests thousands of miles away. But knowing the scientific cause does not diminish the haunting power of the event. Think about the fragility of our reality. We assume that day follows night. We assume that noon is bright. We build our entire civilization, our agriculture, our economy, our psychology around the reliable rhythm of the sky. But on that day, the rhythm broke. The smoke of a distant fire was enough to turn noon into midnight and turn rational men into apocalyptic prophets. It reminds us that we are small creatures living under a vast and temperamental sky. We are at the mercy of the wind and the smoke and the light. So, as you lie in the dark tonight, be thankful for it. Be thankful that this darkness is natural. Be thankful that you can turn on a lamp if you choose. And be thankful that, in a few hours, the sun will rise again.
because history has shown us that is not always a guarantee. Let us travel now to the crisp autumn of 1954. The world is looking up, not in fear of a dark day, but in fascination. The flying saucer craze is sweeping the globe. People are watching the skies with a mixture of wonder and paranoia. Our destination is not a battlefield or a remote tundra, but the historic city of Florence, Italy. It is October 27th. The war has been over for nearly a decade, and the city of the Renaissance is bustling with life. The air is cool, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts and the fading warmth of the Tuscan sun. At the Stadio Artemio Franchi, a football match is underway. Fiorentina is playing Pistoiese. 10,000 spectators are packed into the concrete stands, cheering, chanting, lost in the rhythm of the game. On the field, the players are pushing for an advantage. It is a scene of intense, grounded focus. But at 2:20 p.m., the game stops. It doesn't end with a whistle or a goal. It ends because the crowd goes silent. 10,000 pairs of eyes turn away from the ball and look up. The players on the field stop running. The referee freezes, his whistle dropping from his lips. High above the stadium, moving slowly and silently against the azure sky, are objects, not planes, not birds. Witnesses described them as eggs or cigars, glistening silver in the sunlight. They drift lazily, almost playfully, over the cathedral dome, over the Arno River, and directly over the stadium. And then something begins to fall. It is not rain, it is not snow. It is a fine, glittering substance that drifts down from the objects like a gentle snowfall. It catches the light, shimmering with a pearlescent glow. It covers the field, the players, the rooftops of Florence, draping the city in a delicate white veil. The Italians called it Bambagia Silicea, silicious cotton, but the world would come to know it by a more poetic and haunting name, angel hair. Imagine the sensation of standing in that stadium, the roar of the crowd replaced by a hushed collective gasp. The sky, usually empty and distant, suddenly dropping a physical piece of itself onto your shoulders. People reached out to catch the substance. It looked like spider webs, or perhaps spun sugar. It was white, sticky, and incredibly fine, but as soon as it touched human skin, it vanished. This is the most maddening characteristic of angel hair. It is transient. It exists for a moment, and then it sublimates, turning from a solid directly into a gas, leaving nothing behind but a faint, oily residue. In the stands, a journalism student named Giorgio Bettini watched as the substance landed on the ivy-covered walls of the stadium. He tried to collect some, gathering the sticky strands onto a stick, desperate to preserve proof of what he was seeing. He managed to shove a sample into a glass jar before it could dissolve. He wasn't the only one. All over Tuscany that day, the snow fell. It draped over the olive groves. It hung from the telegraph wires like festive garland. It covered the forests of the Vallombrosa region. It was a massive atmospheric event. But unlike the meat in Kentucky or the darkness in New England, this was fragile. It felt like the universe was trying to communicate in a whisper, using ink that faded as soon as it was read. Bettini rushed his sample to the Institute of Chemical Analysis at the University of Florence. There, a respected scientist named Professor Giovanni Caneri accepted the jar. He was a man of logic, of formulas and periodic tables. He looked at the white, fibrous mass inside the glass, and he began his tests. The analysis was startling. The substance was not organic.
It was not cobwebs spun by migrating spiders, the usual explanation for such phenomena. Spider silk is made of protein. It contains nitrogen. But the angel hair of Florence contained boron, silicon, calcium, and magnesium. It was a mineral-based glass spun into threads finer than any human machine could produce. It was, essentially, a form of borosilicate glass, the same material used for heat-resistant laboratory equipment, or perhaps the heat shielding of a spacecraft. Professor Canary was baffled. Spiders do not weave glass. Insects do not excrete silicon. The material was completely terrestrial in its chemical makeup, yet utterly alien in its form and delivery. The implications were dizzying. If this was exhaust from the silver eggs seen above the stadium, what kind of engine produces spun glass as a byproduct? Was it a waste product, a form of camouflage, or was it something more intentional, a seeding of the atmosphere? The Florence incident is the most famous case, but it is not the only one. Throughout history, there have been reports of this star jelly or sky silk falling after strange aerial events. In Oloron, France, in 1952, witnesses reported a great cylinder in the sky, surrounded by smaller disks, all of which trailed long white ribbons of this substance. It covered the town, turning the rooftops white for an hour before evaporating into nothingness. In the 18th century, Japanese chronicles speak of cotton falling from the moon. In 19th century America, farmers reported fields covered in webbing that had no spiders. Skeptics, of course, hold fast to the ballooning spider theory. They argue that thousands of tiny spiders migrating on currents of air can create massive sheets of silk that drift down together. It is a known natural phenomenon. It happens. But migrating spiders do not stop football games. They do not appear in conjunction with silver cigars hovering in the sky. And, most importantly, their webs do not evaporate in your hands. Spider silk is one of the strongest biological materials on Earth. It persists, it sticks, it does not turn into gas at the touch of a warm finger. The angel hair remains a physical paradox. It is matter that behaves like a ghost. It is there, and then it is not. It invites us to touch it, and then punishes us for trying.
So, as you lie in the dark, imagine that day in Florence. The noise of the stadium fading, the players standing like statues on the green grass, and the silent white rain falling from the silver shapes above. It is a gentle image. There is no fire here, no blood, just a soft, quiet covering. A blanket tucked around the city by unknown hands. But there is a melancholy to it. We want to hold on to the magic. We want to put the miracle in a jar and keep it on a shelf. But the angel hair reminds us that some mysteries are not meant to be kept. They are meant only to be witnessed. The astum in Professor Canary's lab is long gone. The samples evaporated decades ago. The witnesses are old now, or have passed on. The event exists only in fading newspaper clippings and the memories of those who looked up. It teaches us that reality is not always solid. Sometimes it is as fragile as spun sugar. Sometimes the most profound things in life are the ones that disappear the moment we try to grasp them. The sky over Florence is empty tonight. The stars are watching, and perhaps, somewhere high above the clouds, the weavers are still there, spinning their glass threads, waiting for the right moment to let them fall again.
We have reached the end of our journey, travelers. We have stood in the frozen taiga of Tunguska, walked the fields of Kentucky, watched the sun dance in Portugal, and felt the silken touch of ghosts in Florence. But before we close our eyes, I want you to try one last visualization. Imagine the ocean, not the surface where the waves break and the sun shines, but the deep, the abyss. Down there in the crushing darkness of the Mariana Trench, life takes on alien forms. There are jellyfish that glow with bioluminescent fire, squids that can change their shape in a heartbeat, creatures that look like glass, transparent and fragile, drifting on currents we cannot feel. Now, look up. We often forget that we live at the bottom of an ocean. The atmosphere is a fluid. It has currents, it has layers, it has density. We are the benthic creatures crawling around on the sediment of the planetary floor, weighed down by gravity. Above us lies 60 miles of air, a gas ocean that is just as vast, just as mysterious, and just as unexplored as the deep sea. For centuries, mankind has looked up and seen things it cannot explain. Lights that move with impossible agility, shapes that change form, objects that seem to dissolve into mist. We have called them angels, we have called them demons, we have called them flying saucers. But what if we have been asking the wrong question? We have been asking, who is driving that ship? The final and perhaps most haunting theory of the unexplained suggests that there is no pilot, there is no ship. What if the sky is not empty space, but a habitat? What if the things we see are not visitors from another planet, but the indigenous wildlife of the upper atmosphere?
To understand this, we must go back to a time before science fiction had planted the image of little green men in our heads. We must go to a time when people described exactly what they saw, without the filter of modern technology. The date is September 4th, 1891. The place is Crawfordsville, Indiana. At 2 a.m., two men, a wagon driver named Marshall and a local miller named Swearingen, were preparing their carts for the morning market. The town was asleep. The sky was clear. Suddenly, Marshall looked up and froze. He grabbed Swearingen's arm, pointing a trembling finger at the sky. Hovering about 300 feet above them was a monster. They did not describe a metal craft. They did not describe a saucer with rivets and windows. They described a living, breathing nightmare. They said it was roughly 20 feet long and 8 feet wide. It had no distinct head and no tail. It looked like an oblong, fleshy mass. But it was the movement that terrified them. It possessed several pairs of side fins, or perhaps wings, that were beating the air rapidly. It didn't glide like a bird. It swam. It moved through the air exactly the way a flounder moves along the bottom of the sea, undulating, rippling, propelling itself against the atmosphere. And it was not silent. As it circled the town, the men heard a sound, not the hum of an engine, but a wheezing noise, a labored, wet, panting sound, like a heavy animal struggling to breathe in pain. The creature circled a local ice plant, hovered over a house, and then, with a final beat of its fins, ascended rapidly into the clouds and vanished. The next night, hundreds of people in Crawfordsville saw it again. They described the same flaming red eye in the center of the mass, and the same writhing, swimming motion. It was the Crawfordsville monster. History has tried to dismiss this as a flock of birds, specifically killdeer, which have white underbellies and make loud calls. But flocks of birds do not form a solid 20-foot rectangle. They do not wheeze, and they do not terrify grown men into hiding under their wagons. Marshall and Swearingen saw something biological, something that belonged in a nightmare or an ocean. Fast forward 50 years to World War II. The skies over Europe and the Pacific are filled with the most advanced machines humanity has ever built. Bombers, fighters, rockets. But pilots on both sides, American and German, began to report company. They called them Foo Fighters, small glowing orbs of light, red, orange, or white, that would appear off the wingtips of their planes. The pilots were terrified. They thought these were secret weapons, tracking devices, or remote-controlled bombs. But the behavior of the Foo Fighters didn't make sense. They didn't attack, they didn't explode, they didn't follow aerodynamic laws. They played. Pilots reported that the lights would dance around the fuselage, dive in and out of the clouds, and mimic the movements of the plane, like a curious dolphin riding the bow wave of a ship. They seemed intelligent, but not in a mathematical, military way. They seemed animalistic. When the pilots tried to engage them, turning sharply or firing their guns, the lights would simply vanish, blinking out like a bioluminescent squid going dark in the abyss, only to reappear miles away. After the war, neither the Americans nor the Germans claimed the technology. The Foo Fighters remained an anomaly. But if you look at them through the lens of the atmospheric beast theory, they make perfect sense. They were curious creatures, attracted by the electromagnetic fields of the aircraft, or perhaps the heat of the engines. They were not machines. They were the jellyfish of the stars, coming down to investigate the strange, loud metal whales that had invaded their territory.
In the 1950s, a researcher named Trevor James Constable took this theory to its logical extreme. He proposed that the upper atmosphere is home to a vast ecosystem of invisible life forms. He called them critters. Constable argued that these creatures are amoeba-like, macroscopic single-celled organisms that vary in size from a coin to a city block. They are normally invisible to the naked eye because they are almost pure energy, or perhaps they exist in the infrared spectrum. He believed they spend their lives drifting in the ionosphere, feeding on cosmic rays, electromagnetic energy, and starlight. They are fragile, they are low density, but occasionally, when they are injured or when they die, they become heavy. They precipitate down into the lower atmosphere. This brings us back to the angel hair. Remember the spun glass that evaporated in Florence? Constable would argue that this is the residue of a dying atmospheric beast. As the creature's body loses its cohesion, it sheds its outer membrane, falling to Earth as a gelatinous or fibrous mass that sublimates back into energy as soon as it touches the ground. It brings us back to the star jelly, the rotting remains of a sky creature. It brings us back to the meat shower of Kentucky, perhaps a predator of the upper air that met a violent end, ripped apart by a sudden pressure change, raining its organic matter onto the fields below. It is a theory that sounds insane until you look at the ocean. We find new species in the deep sea every year. We find life in volcanic vents, in acid lakes, in nuclear reactors. Life is tenacious. It fills every niche. Why would the sky, the largest habitat on our planet, be the only place that is empty?
And so we end our journey here. The sky above you is dark now. The stars are out, but try not to see them as distant suns in a vacuum. Try to see them as the bioluminescent lights of a vast, unseen reef. Perhaps the sources are just the hard shells of sky crustaceans. Perhaps the lights are the lures of sky anglers. Perhaps the clouds that hide them are not always made of water vapor. It is a terrifying thought that we are being watched by things that feed on energy. But it is also beautiful. It means we are not alone. It means the Earth is even more alive than we dared to imagine. It is wrapped in a living shell, a breathing cocoon that separates us from the cold. We are safe down here, heavy, solid, grounded by gravity. We belong to the rock and the soil. They belong to the wind and the light. So close your eyes, let the gravity hold you. Let the blanket cover you. You are safe in the deep. Let the things in the sky swim their endless circles. They have their world and we have ours. Good night, travelers. Sleep well. And remember, if you see a light in the sky that moves like a fish, do not be afraid. Just watch it swim. This has been the Dreamscape of history.